It's Bob Gomez, and we are going to be studying this morning in Mark chapter 14, and we're going to be talking about the Passover and the Lord's Supper. Okay, so the Passover then was a feast which was instituted about 1,500 years before Christ, when the children of Israel were in slavery in Egypt, and God had raised up Moses to deliver the children of Israel out of their bondage in Egypt. And he sent Moses into Egypt to lead his people out. And he went to Pharaoh and told him that God wanted his people to come out into the desert and to offer sacrifices and worship him. But Pharaoh refused to let them go, and so then God sent these plagues upon Egypt, 10 plagues in all, and they were quite a number of various things. The water was turned to blood. They had some sort of lice throughout the land. They got in everything. They had frogs. They got in everything. They had locust plague. They had darkness. They had these sores like boils on their skin, and this was also on the cattle, and various other plagues. And finally, after every plague, then Pharaoh would relent and says, "Well, take away the plague, and I'll let the people go." So then Moses would take away that plague, and then Pharaoh would change his mind, and then refuse to let the people of Israel go. So then God would send another plague, and the same thing happened. The plague would come upon the land of Egypt and would torment the people, whether it be frogs or lice or boils or whatever it was. And so Pharaoh would say, "Take away the plague and I'll let the people go." Well, this went on, and this Pharaoh would always change his mind and refuse to let the people go. Finally, the last plague was the plague where God would pass through the land of Egypt and enter into the house of each family, and firstborn son in every house would be slain, would be put to death, unless they had applied blood to the front doorposts and the lintel across the top. And if they had applied the blood that way, then then God would pass over that house, and that's where we get the word Passover from. God would pass over that house and would not enter that house to slay the firstborn. Now, the first month of the Jewish year was the month Nisan, and on the 10th day of the month, they were to select a lamb that was without blemish and without spot for the Passover, and then they were to keep it for 4 days until the 14th day to make sure that it didn't have any disease or anything. And then on the 14th day of Nisan, they were to kill the lamb as a sacrifice, and then take the blood and apply it to the doorposts. And that was called the Passover lamb. And they were told then to roast the lamb over fire and grate or grill, and they were to eat the Passover lamb fully clothed with their staff in their hand and ready to move out, because that very night they were going to be leaving Egypt. And they were also supposed to have a side dish made up of a combination of sweet and bitter foods. The sweet was like dates and raisins and figs, and those were chopped up. And then there were some bitter herbs. I don't remember what the particular herbs were, and I think it was all mixed with vinegar or something like that to make kind of a sauce. And then there was supposed to be unleavened bread. And so this is what the Passover feast consisted of. So that night, after sunset, because that's the Jewish day begins at sunset. So right after the sunset, they killed the Passover lamb and applied the blood. And of course, the sauce, the bitter and the sweet sauce and the unleavened bread had already been prepared. And so then they ate the Passover, and then God passed through the land of Egypt, entered into every house that did not have the blood on the door, and so the firstborn son in all the houses of Egypt was slain. And so in the middle of the night then the cry arose throughout Egypt, from the house of Pharaoh all the way down to the the poorest. In every household the firstborn son was slain, and this also applied to cattle. So then they come to Moses and they beg Moses to leave, and actually they pay him to leave. They want them to get out just as fast as they can, because now they realize that this is really God that's doing this, that it wasn't just coincidence. And now they realize that the anger of God has been kindled against them, and they are terrified. And so the Egyptians that had the Israelites as slaves probably for over 100 years, although the Israelites had been in Egypt for several hundred years, the whole time was not in slavery. It wasn't until after Joseph and everything, and that dynasty of the pharaohs was overthrown. So a new pharaoh came to the throne, and he did not know Joseph or the Israelites, and they were afraid because the Israelites had multiplied so much that if the enemy would come up and attack Egypt, that the Israelites would join with the enemy and take sides against them. And so they enslaved them. And remember, at the time of Moses' birth, they were the Pharaoh at that time had ordered that all the male children should be thrown into the river and be drowned. And so Moses was now 80 years old at the time of the Passover, because he had spent, remember, he was rescued out of the river by Pharaoh's daughter, and she raised him as her own son for about 40 years, and he received the finest education that was available in the world at that time, because at that time Egypt was the superpower. They were the greatest nation on earth at that time. They had the greatest education system, and so Moses had the finest education that was available. And then 40 years of age, he identified himself with the Israelites, and because he killed a slave driver who was beating an Israelite slave, he killed him. He had to flee from Egypt, and so he left the country and went to the east, to the land of Midian, and there he spent the next 40 years of his life as a shepherd. So then that's where he saw the burning bush, and that was when God sent him back to Egypt. So Moses is now 80 years old, and on the night that the firstborn son in each household died, and the Egyptians realized that they were really dealing with the true God, the Almighty God, and realized that the anger of God was against them, they rushed to get the Israelites out of the country. They wanted them to be gone as soon as possible, so they gave them the wealth of Egypt, all the gold and silver and the precious stones and everything. They gave them to the Israelites, and so this, in a sense, made up for the slavery that they had been to. In other words, it was payment for the hundreds of years of slavery that they had undergone. And so when the Israelites left Egypt that night, Egypt was practically destroyed. Actually, it was destroyed because they had all 10 plagues. Remember, all their crops had been eaten by the locusts, and now their firstborn sons were dead, and the country itself was ruined, and so now they take all their wealth. So Egypt is bankrupt. So they go out of Egypt toward the east, toward the Red Sea, and God was leading them by a cloud, pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And God led them right to the shore of the Red Sea. And they come to the shore of the Red Sea, and of course they can't go any further. And then they discovered that Pharaoh had once again changed his mind and sent his army to bring back the Israelites. And so as the army is approaching and the Israelites become terrified, then God moves the cloud behind them and covers the Egyptian army with a cloud. It was so thick that the Egyptian army couldn't see where they were going. They couldn't even see the hand in front of their face. And then God caused a wind to blow from the east and parted the Red Sea and dried out a path through the sea. And so the children of Israel were able to go through the Red Sea on dry land. And it's estimated that there were about 2 million at that time, because not only were there Israelites, but there were a lot of Egyptians who had realized that the God of Israel was the true God, and so they wanted to worship the true God and follow God, so they came out with the Israelites. And so there were about 2 million of them, and all during the night they crossed the Red Sea on dry land. And then in the morning, or near the morning, they all got across, and then God lifted the cloud, and the Egyptians saw that the Israelites had escaped and that the water was parted, so they attempted to go through the Red Sea to capture and bring back the Israelites, but as they were in the middle, then Moses raised up his staff, and the wind stopped, and the waters came back and drowned Egypt's army. So Egypt is totally wiped out. Their army is drowned, their wealth has been taken, all their crops have failed, their firstborn sons are dead. Egypt is ruined. And from there they go down to Mount Sinai, where God gives them the law, including the 10 Commandments and all the plans for the tabernacle. Tabernacle was a portable temple. It was a tent. It could be taken down and put up, and this was all done by the Levites, and could be loaded on carts and transported from place to place. So what it was a portable temple. It was a tent, and had all the sacred furniture and the lampstand and the altars and the laver, the golden laver for washing, and everything associated with the temple. It was portable. And so God gave them the plan for that, and that's where they actually built it. They built the first tabernacle, made all the materials for it. It had coverings over it. Some were made out of animal skins, others were made out of different kinds of cloths. And all the furniture that was all made right there at Mount Sinai during that year. So you recall that after that year was over, God then told them to go to the promised land that he had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their forefathers. And so that was the land of Canaan. And so it's less than 2 weeks of march or walk from Mount Sinai up to the promised land. So they get to the promised land and they decide to send in spies, to send in spies from each of the tribes of Israel, and the spies go in, they see that it's a wonderful land, very fertile. The clusters of grapes takes 2 men to carry them. The fields all fertile. There was wheat and barley and all the olive trees, and it's just a wonderful land. With one big drawback: there are giants in the land. Remember Goliath? Well, he was just one of a huge family of giants. But they see these giants, and they see the cities there with all fortified walls and everything, and so they lose their faith, and they say, oh, if we try to conquer the land, these giants will kill us and eat us probably. But so anyway, they become terrified. They don't believe that God can take care of them. And 2 of the spies said, God will do it, and that was Joshua and Caleb. But all the rest of the spies said, no, we'll die. And so that because of that, their lack of faith, they said, we will die and our children will die. And God chastised them because they didn't have faith. And so he says, yes, you were afraid you were going to die. You will die, because I'm not going to let you go in. You're going to wander in the wilderness for 40 years until all of you have died. So that generation passed away. And so everyone who was over 20 years old on that day died in the wilderness during that 40 years. And he said, you thought your children were also going to get killed? No, your children are going to be the ones who are going to go in. So only people who were 20 years and younger on that day survived the 40 years in the wilderness. And so then that was a generation that went in and conquered the land of Canaan. And the only so that would have, they were 20 years old plus the 40 years that they were in the wilderness. So that was, everybody was 60 years old or younger except for the 2 spies, Joshua and Caleb. They were the only ones that were over 60 years old. And so then they went in, and then under the leadership of Joshua, they conquered the land. Okay, so there was this feast called the Feast of the Passover, plus that lasted for 1 day. Then there was the Feast of Unleavened Bread, or also went by the name of the Feast of Booths, and that lasted 7 days, and that commemorated the 40 years in the wilderness. And so the 2 feasts were celebrated together. The first, it was an 8-day celebration. The first day was the Passover, and then the 7 days after that was the Feast of Booths, and all the males in Israel were required to go up to Jerusalem to attend the feast. And they camped all around Jerusalem, and they built themselves little sheds or little booths out of branches to commemorate the wandering in the wilderness and how the people had to live in tents. Okay, so this is what's happening now on the last day before the crucifixion. Okay, remember Jesus had sent the 2 disciples into the city of Jerusalem to prepare them a place where Jesus and his disciples could hold the Passover. And so Jesus sent these 2 disciples, and there was a man carrying a pitcher of water that Jesus had told them about, and he goes into the house. And so that's where these 2 disciples prepare for the Passover. Now remember, the Jewish method of marking time, their day started at sunset. So we would say by our reckoning, it would be Thursday evening at sunset would be the end of Thursday and the beginning of Friday. So their Friday began at sundown on what would be our Thursday evening. So right after sundown, that's when they killed the Passover lamb, and then they roasted, and then they have their Passover feast. And so this is now by Jewish reckoning, this is Friday, and then there will be the night in which Jesus is betrayed and he's arrested, and the trials begin. The two trials were during the night, one before Annas and one before Caiaphas. Then the next day there would be the trial before Pontius Pilate, and then there would be another trial before Herod, and then another trial before Pontius Pilate again. And then by 9 o'clock in the morning, Pilate would give the order to crucify Jesus. So Jesus was crucified about 9 in the morning. He died about 3 in the afternoon. So it all happened on the same day, on the Passover day. And we're told in the Bible that Christ is our Passover. So that signifies that the Passover was a type or an illustration or a symbol which pointed to Christ. And the way that works out is just as the blood of the Passover lamb was applied to the doorposts, and that protected the people inside from the wrath of God as he passed through Egypt, so they survived and they were not killed, the firstborn was not killed. So the blood of Christ protects us from the wrath of God, so we will not be condemned, and we will be forgiven, and then we can go to heaven and have eternal life. So the death of Christ on the cross was symbolized by the death of the Passover lamb. So when Christ died on the cross and shed his blood, that's the blood that protects us. Just as the blood of the Passover lamb protected the people that were inside the house on which the blood had been applied. Okay, so with that as a background, so they, Jesus and the other disciples then arrive at the house where the first two disciples, which were probably Peter and John, but we're not really sure that that was it, but it probably was. So where they had prepared the Passover, they had either prepared or purchased the unleavened bread and the sauce, the sweet and bitter sauce, and they had killed and roasted the lamb. And so then the Lord arrives with the other 10 disciples, and they begin observing the Passover. Okay, so in Mark chapter 14 and verse 12, it says, then on the first day of unleavened bread, okay, that would be the Passover. The first day they call the whole 8 days unleavened bread, and the first day of that was the Passover. When the Passover lamb was being sacrificed, his disciples said to him, where do you want us to go and prepare for you to eat the Passover? And he sent 2 of his disciples and said to them, go into the city, and a man will meet you carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him, and wherever he enters, say to the owner of the house, the teacher says, where is my guest room in which I may eat the Passover with my disciples? And he himself will show you a large upper room furnished and ready. Prepare for us there. Okay, so the 2 disciples then go into the city, and they find it's probably a servant carrying this water, a pitcher of water, and he would be fairly easy to spot because usually men don't carry water, or usually that's the women who do that. But they find this man, and they follow him to the house, and when they get there, then the owner of the house, the two disciples say to the owner of the house that they need the guest room. It says the teacher says. So the owner of the house probably knew that they meant Jesus, and so this means he probably was also a follower of Jesus. So he was had a large house, and so he probably was fairly wealthy. And in their culture, hospitality was really important. And so if a person had a guest room and a stranger came and asked for the use of that guest room, it was their custom to allow that, especially on the Passover. And so, according to culture and custom, the man had this guest room, and it was all ready and prepared. And so, when the disciples came and asked for the use of that room, it was ready to turn over to them because that was their culture, that was their custom. So then they prepared the Passover, verse 17. And when it was evening, he, that is Jesus, came with the 12, and as they were reclining at the table and eating, Jesus said, Truly I say to you, that one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me. Okay, so between verse 17 and 18, we know that from the Gospel of John, that Jesus washed the disciples' feet, taking a humble position, which was the lowest of the servants did that job, to wash the guests' feet. And so Jesus took the lowest position as a servant and washed the other disciples' feet, showing them that they needed to serve one another and be humble. And then right after that, then they ate the Passover, and it was during right toward the end of eating the Passover that Jesus revealed that one of the disciples would betray him. Remember, the Apostle John was on one side of Jesus, leaning on him, and on the other side of Jesus was Judas Iscariot, and then probably somewhere over on the other side of the table was Peter. And so when Jesus said that one of them would betray him, everyone was stunned and startled, and they started doing some self-evaluation. They say, verse 19, and they began to be grieved and say to him one by one, Surely not I. And of course Judas had already made arrangements with the Jews to betray Jesus, and so he of course knew that Jesus was talking about him, but being the hypocrite that he was, he didn't say anything. He just did like they did. He himself said, It's not me, is it? So then Peter, who was across the table, kind of motions to John for John to ask Jesus who he's talking about. And so John asks Jesus, and then Jesus says to John, what we have here in verse 20, he said to them, It is one of the 12, one who dips with me in the bowl. So what they would do is they would have this bowl with the sweet figs and dates and raisins and the spices and herbs that were bitter, and they would take and break off a piece of unleavened bread, just kind of like a dip it in the sauce and eat it. And so Jesus and Judas dipped in at the same time, right after that, because and then Jesus handed his morsel to Judas. And so then Judas ate it, and when Jesus does that, he says to Judas, what you're going to do quickly. And Judas was the only one who knew what Jesus was talking about. Everybody else thought that Jesus was saying that Judas should go out and buy more provisions for the Passover, or else to go out and give alms to the poor, something like that. So Judas gets up and leaves. And then after Judas is gone, there's just the 11 disciples, and then Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper. So Judas was not present, and Judas did not take of the Lord's Supper. So going on to verse 20, and he said to them, it is one of the 12, one who dips with me in the bowl. For the Son of Man is to go just as it is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been good for that man if he had not been born. Okay, so Jesus is saying that it is already predestined that he be betrayed and that he be arrested and tried and beaten and crucified and die and be buried and rise for the dead. All this was already predestined, predetermined. And particularly that he would be betrayed, but he says, woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. Okay, so this shows us that God has everything all planned out, even that he would be betrayed, but that the person who does betray him also has a free will, and he is responsible for his own actions, even though it had been predetermined that would happen. So in other words, even though it was predetermined that Judas betray him, Judas is still responsible for his own actions.